Can we talk about money? Big cathedrals.
Enough already with the slang words. In researching this video, I've learned a lot about everything language to do with talking about money. So there's loads of slang words across lots of languages. Something else I discovered is about the history of money and language. So, you know, stuff like, where does the word dollar come from? Why are there so many countries that use the word dollar as the name of their currency? And what was the world's first international currency? And that one might surprise you. It surprised me. Let's go. A lot of the slang words for money are about food. So you've got stuff like bread, dough, gravy, lettuce in English, blé, which means wheat, oreille, no, not oreille, oseille, which means sorrel. I don't know what that is. It's a plant, apparently. Foin, hay in Quebec, French. Pasta in Spanish, meaning, I think, dough, not spaghetti. Manteca, lard. Kapusta in Russian, which I think is another, like lettuce, it's referring to the fact that American currency, the US dollar, has a very imaginative and creative use of the colour green. Then we've got animal slang. Not slang used by animals, as far as we know, but names for animals used as slang for money. So we've got buck for US dollar. And one of the explanations for that is that people used to trade in deer skins, which must have been a bit of a pain, you know, in terms of like filling up your wallet before a night out. Also, giving change must have been fun. And the word buck comes from that. I can't really see it. I mean, the vast majority of people in the US in 1776, 1779, I think it was, when the currency was first created, had never traded in buckskins. So, I don't know, I think it comes from somewhere else. There's lots of these myths about how these slang words came about. German has a very interesting relationship between money and animals. So, two words that you can use in German to talk about money are Kröten, toads, and Mäuse, mice. Do you want to come out for a beer? No, I haven't got any mice. How about a pizza tonight? No, total lack of toads tonight, mate. If you're enjoying this so far, give it a like. And if you're not subscribed, then do so forthwith. One English one about animals is Bugs Bunny, which is Cockney rhyming slang for money. Also in Quebec, people say yuar for Canadian dollar because a yuar is a loon, which I think is a kind of bird. And on the Canadian $1 coin, there is a picture of said bird. And I think Anglophone Canadians call them loonies. Argentina and Uruguay have lots of different words for money, one of which is mosca, meaning fly, as in, you know, like annoying insect. An Argentinian word for money is patacones, which I was confused because patacon I know as being like a slice of plantain fried. And there's a song, Patacon, Patacon, peace out, peace out. There's an old coin called a patacon, so I don't know if the plantain dish is named after the coin or vice versa. What are we going to call this coin? I know, let's call it slice of banana. Looking into the word dollar took me down all kinds of rabbit holes, or toad holes. In the 16th century, there was a guy who rejoiced under the absolutely fantastic name of Hieronymus Schlick. He was a count of Bohemia, which is now in the Czech Republic, Czechia. There was a silver mine in Count Schlick's territory, in a valley called Joachimsthal. So Tal is German for valley, so it was the valley of Saint Joachim. And Count Schlick, I'm going to get done by the Schlick family if I'm not careful. Count Schlick made, they weren't that big, some silver coins that were called Joachimsthaler. This then got shortened to Thaler, and lots of silver coins were then called Thaler around the world. And to English ears, this sounded like dollar. Fast forward to the Spanish Empire, which at one point encompassed like great swathes of North America, all of Central America and most of South America, where there was lots of silver. So the Spanish Empire also used the kind of template of the thaler to make a coin that was called the peso de a ocho. English speakers, they knew ocho, but they heard peso de a as pieces of. So this coin came to be known as these coins came to be known as pieces of eight. Cue the parrot.
Pieces of 8.
So the peso, meaning weight, was that you could weigh these coins to check their purity, the silver content, and also they were worth 8 reales, and the real was the currency at the time. Because of the connection to the thaler, these coins in the English-speaking world came to be known as the Spanish dollar. In the British colonies of North America, they used pounds, shillings and pence. Sometimes actual British pounds, shillings and pence, and sometimes the different colonies created their own. But they tended to sometimes got to be in short supply, so many people liked the fact that these Spanish dollars had guaranteed purity, so there was a lot of confidence in this money. When the colonies gained independence from Great Britain, there were all kinds of conversations about what their currency should be. They based the main unit of currency on pretty much the weight of silver of one of these Spanish dollars. There were lots of conversations about what they were going to call this currency, the Liberty, the Union, etc. But people were already calling the coins dollars, so in the end they just went with what was familiar. I said earlier how difficult it was to give change when you were trading in buckskins. The piece of 8, or the Spanish dollar, didn't present the same problem because you could chop them up. So because it was 8 reals, people used to kind of cut them into bits. And you could have a half a dollar and a quarter a dollar and an eighth of a dollar, which was called a bit. The bits were called bits. So that's easy to remember. They're probably quite sharp in your pocket. And that remains in expressions like 2-bit, meaning cheap. Not to bit, but 2 bits. 2-bit, like a 2-bit hood. Thank you, Jimmy Cagney, for that one. This is so up to date, this video. Which is also why the US has quarter coins. It's quite unusual in decimal currencies to have a 25-cent coin, but that was 2 bits. Talking in bits also influenced some Native American languages. So in Navajo, for example, 55 cents is the yal do litzo, or literally 4 bits and a yellow one. 63 cents is the yal do ba'a t'atlai dot lij dot hatsindao. 4 bits, and in addition 1 green and 3 cents. That's what I meant by the first international currency. Spanish galleons used to go between Acapulco and Manila, Mexico to the Philippines, taking all this silver and various goods that they would trade for nice Asian stuff. And so this Spanish silver coins then spread around the world, spread around East Asia in particular. Chinese merchants used to put their stamps, their own chop marks on the dollars to show that they'd kind of tested the quality, and this kind of guaranteed their authenticity. Some Chinese people thought that Charles IV of Spain looked a bit like the Buddha. So they called Spanish dollars 佛头元, Buddha head silver. Another name was yuanyin, meaning round silver. And that character for round eventually became the name of the Chinese currency, yuan, not yuan, please, which was then exported to Japan as the yen or en, and to Korea as the won. Little by little, countries gave up on this mad system. The US was one of the first countries to decimalize its currency. So one of the first. The Russian ruble was the first, where the ruble was divided into 100 kopecks. So the US dollar was divided into 100 cents. One of the things that surprises me about the fact that the US was one of the first countries to decimalize its currency was that they then held on to pounds and ounces and miles and feet and inches, a system that's actually called imperial. So, you cast off an empire and then you're the last vestige of clinging to these ancient measures. So the French Revolution, that the French had invented the metric system, and you'd think the US and France were such big pals that the US would have been one of the first places to adopt it rather than not having done it yet in 2025. Fellow Americans, tell me in the comments why you love pounds and ounces. Previously, they'd used pounds, shillings and pence, where £1 was composed of 20 shillings and each shilling was 12 pence. Now that system was called LSD, not the hallucinogenic. It was L for libre, S for solidi, and D for denarii. Latin. Now those Latin words were coins in the late Roman Empire, and Charlemagne based his system of money on that in the Holy Roman Empire, which you'll remember was not holy, not Roman, and not an empire. So a libra, plural libre, was a pound, and there's a lot to do with a pound of silver as the origin of some of these coins. There was a coin called the solidus, which is where the S in LSD comes from. And that's where we get words like soldi in Italian, soldato, someone who was paid in solidi, and thence soldier in English, soldado in Spanish, soldat in French, etc. Denarius, plural denarii, gives us dinero in Spanish, dinheiro in Portuguese, and dinar, which is the name of several currencies across North Africa and sometimes in former Yugoslavia. These systems of different bases for different currencies, for different elements of the currency, made mathing very, very difficult. It's very difficult to math when you've got one column where 12 things go to the next column, and then that column, 20 things go to the next column. I found out that for quite a lot of time between after the Second World War until the 60s, the exchange rate between the pound, the British pound sterling, and the US dollar was fixed at £1 was $2.20. So that meant that when you arrived at Heathrow Airport and you went to the Bureau de Change and you said, hello, how much do I get for $1? They'd say, 8 and 4 pence. Okay, what does that mean? Oh, that means 8 shillings and 4 pennies. Okay. So $10 is 84 shillings? Well, yes, but actually we call that £4 3 and 4 pence. Converting in your head must have been an absolute nightmare. If you would care to shower me with money, there's a little super thanks button down below, and every contribution is really appreciated. Thank you so much. The Spanish dollar, or piece of 8, was then spread around the world, and that's shillings and pence. In 1966, for example, Australia decided that they were going to make 10 shillings into their new currency that would then be divided up into 100 somethings. And they did some research, they did an opinion poll, and they asked people what they wanted this new currency to be called, and some of the options were Crown, Regal, Royal, Tasman, Austral. And then so the result of this consultation was that the new currency was going to be called the Royal. Your average Australian wasn't overly pleased with this idea, and there were big protests. So that's why the Australian currency is now went from the Australian pound to the Australian dollar. But this wasn't because of any great admiration that they may or may not have had for the greenback. It was more that those Spanish dollars had been in circulation in Australia, and still in the kind of collective memory, there was this idea, there were words for coins that were dollars, so that's why it was chosen. And a very similar thing happened across what used to be the British Empire, with many currencies becoming the dollar divided up into hundreds. The United Kingdom eventually followed suit, so on the 15th of February 1971, pounds, shillings and pence were done away with, but instead of going the dollar route, and they were also going to call it the Royal and various other things, They stuck with the pound. So a pound was divided up into 100 new pence. And interestingly, this meant that the language changed overnight. Previously, when talking about numbers of pence, people would fuse the number and the pence bit together. So you'd get a penny, twopence, threepence, fourpence, fivepence, sixpence, sevenpence, eightpence, ninepence, tenpence, 11pence, a shilling. Overnight, people started saying 2 new pence. Now, they didn't stay new for long, so then it became 2 pence or 2p. But no one said twopence about 2 decimal pennies. And in fact, people don't say a penny, they say 1p. Just like bucks for dollars, people say quid for pounds, but it doesn't have a plural. So it's, instead of saying give me 10 bucks, you say give me 10 quid. If you say 10 quids, you're definitely not from round here. There was a slang word for shillings, which was bob. And also bob didn't have a plural, so 10 bob. Members of the scouting community used to knock on your door and say, "Bob a job?" Everyone in the 1960s spoke like that. "All right, mister, do you want to bob a job?" Which meant that they would do some kind of menial task about your home for the princely sum of a shilling. 11 US cents at the time. Bargain. There are various theories about which Robert this was named after, but people really don't know. And quid, no one really knows where the term quid comes from. There's a theory that it was quid pro quo, but I don't think people like you and me ran around speaking Latin in the 19th century. And that's when many of these slang terms for coins or for denominations in British English come from. Bobs died with decimalisation. Massive kind of massacre of bobs. So people would say a 2 bob bit, which was also called a florin, named after the Italian or the Florentine coin il fiorino. So 2 bob bit, but no one called a 10 pence piece that. And the bit seems to have changed into pieces, or a 10p piece. Again, tell me if I'm wrong. I'm sure you will. There used to be a coin called a farthing, which comes from the Old English farthing, which means little fourth, which was worth a quarter of a penny. There was a halfpenny, interesting pronunciation of half there. They were done away with before 1971. There was something called a threepenny bit, which had a wonderful design to it with portcullises on, and it was made of a kind of yellowish material. I used to collect them. The sixpenny bit was called a tanner. And popular imagination says that this was named after John Sigmund Tanner. You actually had adjectives based on these penny amounts. So you could get a tuppenny halfpenny thing, which is like a 2-bit thing. Cheap, nasty. Half a pound of tuppenny rice, half a pound of treacle. And there were words to talk about a quantity of things that you could buy for a certain amount. So a penneth of something was like a penny's worth. "Can I have 2 penneth of sweets, please, mister?" we would say in our cute 1960s Cockney-ish. My nana used to call me and my cousin daft apeths, which later on I realised was a halfpenny worth, a half penny worth. I thought she was calling us some kind of monkey. If you like this video, check out this one next. The algorithm says you'll love it. And bye for now.